for, he published a really, really important book called The Theory of the Leisure Class, because he was so fascinated by it and did a serious, I think it's never been replaced really for the validity of a serious study of class structure, particularly as it was advanced, well, in America, but especially in New York society at the turn of the century. And he also is responsible for calling this time period the Gilded Age, and also for talking about the concept of what he called conspicuous consumption, which is basically having so much money that on some level you dedicate your life to buying and spending so much money that you impress people enough that they come to great, great respect for you. Consumption way beyond anything you could possibly need, and conspicuous so that people would not fail to notice it. And one of the things in this male-dominated society, males specifically in business, and one of the things that came with that was that you needed a wife who was your decoration. I mean, this is not a new, I mean, what you see of that today is not new. It's not a new idea. It's never been. But the women that Edith Wharton writes about are women, and she often writes about her novels from the point of view of women, so that you understand that they were able to live lives of interest and passion and so forth, but that was only around and beyond their lives as women who were beautiful, women who were able to organize, because they themselves had no familiarity with kitchens or catering or anything, but they could organize at a drop of a hat. They could organize a wonderful dinner party. They were really just the decorative object of their men. And one of the things that happens with this, and I do plan any second now really to get to the book, to the story, is that it's not an environment that is designed towards women friendships at all. Women become, as a result, part of the competition, which by nature they might not have been inclined to. Competition for who you marry in terms of who is very acceptable and who not. And once you're married, remaining very beautiful. It means from the beginning there is a kind of competition that is hard on the notion of friendship, female friendship. But she writes about women who, by dint of their bravery, often insist on forming those kinds of meaningful relationships. So I started by saying that Roman fever, in the time that Edith Wharton was writing, the source of malaria and typhoid fever, and they are based apparently, and I say this from my reading, not because I know it, okay, but that both typhoid and typhoid fever and malaria have the same base and are carried by mosquitoes. And so in the ruins of Rome, the Palatine Hill and so forth, and especially the Colosseum, which is central as an idea, at least, and an image into the story, at night, that's where you could, if you went for a romantic adventure, and it didn't have to be romantic, just any kind of adventure, you ran the risk of contracting the fever and dying from it. And we want to keep that in mind. There is discussion in the story about the origins of Roman fever, and then how in the century in which our main characters, that is Grace Ansley and Alida Slade, they grow up. The idea of going into the Coliseum late at night for some kind of assignation or just some kind of adventure, they were likely just to contract a really bad cold, because at night the temperature dropped precipitously there and changed it. It was a very different place from Rome itself. That is the street, let's say, level. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I just wanted to remind you of the family structures here. Basically, our main characters and the men are not seen in this story. This is not about them, even though they are driving forces behind it. Our two families, Grace Ansley and her husband, whose name is Horace, and they have a child, and that child's name is Barbara, or sometimes referred to as Babs. And then there's also Alida Slade, A-L-I-D-A, Alida Slade, and her husband is, what is his husband? Delphin, D-E-L-P-H-I-N, Delphin Slade, and they have a child whose name is Jenny. And they had also a son who died young. And so we are dealing with two families of currently three people, two daughters who are about the same age and can be compared in their friendship with Alida Slade and Grace Ansley. Okay, so better than my going on, I'd like to read the story to you. The final enhanced publication of the book of the story, as Mark said, is 1936. So here goes. I hope you enjoy it, and you'll let us know. So, from the table at which they had been lunching, two American ladies of ripe but well-cared-for middle age moved across the lofty terrace of the Roman restaurant and, leaning on its parapet, looked first at each other and then down at the outspread glories of the Palatine and the Forum, with the same expression of vague but benevolent approval of what they were seeing. As they leaned there, a girlish voice echoed up gaily from the stairs leading to the court below. "Well, come along then," it cried, not to them, but to an invisible companion, "and let's leave the young things to do their knitting." And a voice, just as fresh, laughed back. "Oh, look here, Babs, not actually knitting." "Well, I meant figuratively," rejoined the first. "After all, we haven't left our poor parents much else to do." At that point, the turn of the stairs engulfed the dialogue. The two ladies looked at each other again, this time with a tinge of smiling embarrassment, and the smaller and paler one shook her head and colored slightly. "Barbara," she murmured, sending an unheard rebuke after the mocking voice in the stairway. The other lady, who was fuller and higher in color, with a small, determined nose supported by vigorous black eyebrows, gave a good-humored laugh. "That's what our daughters think of us." Her companion replied by a deprecating gesture. "Not all of us individually. We must remember that. It's just the collective modern idea of mothers." And you see, half guiltily, she drew from her handsome, mounted black handbag a twist of crimson silk and run through by two fine knitting needles. Her knitting. "One never knows," she murmurs. "The new system has certainly given us a good deal of time to kill. And sometimes I get tired of just looking, even at this." Her gesture towards the city was now addressed to the stupendous scene at their feet. The dark lady laughed again, and they both relapsed upon the view, contemplating it in silence, with a sort of diffused serenity which might have been borrowed from the spring effulgence of the Roman sky. The luncheon hour was long past. The two had their end of the vast terrace all to themselves. At its opposite extremity, a few groups, detained by a lingering look at the outspread city, were gathering up guidebooks and fumbling for tips. The last of them scattered, and the two ladies were alone in the air-washed height. "Well, I don't see why we shouldn't just stay here," said Mrs. Slade, the lady of the high color and energetic brows. Two derelict basket chairs stood near, and she pushed them into the angle of the parapet and settled herself in one, her gaze upon the Palatine. "After all, it's still the most beautiful view in the world." "It always will be, to me," assented her friend, Mrs. Ansley, with so slight a stress on the me that Mrs. Slade, though she noticed it, wondered if it were not merely accidental, like the random underlinings of old-fashioned letter writers. Great Ansley was always old-fashioned, she thought, and added aloud with a retrospective smile, "It's a view we've both been familiar with for a good many years. When we first met here, we were younger than our girls are now. You remember?" "Oh, yes, I remember," murmured Mrs. Ansley with that same undefinable stress. "There's that head waiter wondering," she interpolated. She was evidently far less sure than her companion of herself and her rights in the world. "I'll cure him of wondering," said Mrs. Slade, stretching her hand toward a bag as discreetly opulent looking as Mrs. Ansley. Signing to the head waiter, she explained that she and her friend were old lovers of Rome and would like to spend the end of the afternoon looking down on the view, that is, if it did not disturb the service. The head waiter, bowing over her gratuity, assured her that the ladies were most welcome and would be still more so if they would condescend to remain for dinner. A full moon night they would remember. Mrs. Slade's black brows grew together as though references to the moon were out of place and even unwelcome. But she smiled away her frown as the head waiter retreated. "Well, why not? We might do worse. There's no knowing, I suppose, when the girls will be back. Do you even know back from where?" "I don't." Mrs. Ansley again colored slightly. "I think those young Italian aviators we met at the embassy invited them to fly to Tarquinia for tea. I suppose they'll want to wait and fly back by moonlight." Moonlight. What a part it still plays. Do you suppose they're as sentimental as we were? "I've come to the conclusion that I don't the least know what they are," said Mrs. Ansley, "and perhaps we didn't know much more about each other." "No, perhaps we didn't," said Mrs. Slade. Her friend gave her a shy glance. "I should never have supposed you were sentimental, Alida." "Well, perhaps I wasn't." Mrs. Slade drew her lids together in retrospect, and for a few moments the two ladies, who had been intimate since childhood, reflected how little they knew each other. Each one, of course, had a label ready to attach to the other's name. Mrs. Delphin Slade, for instance, would have told herself, or anyone who asked her, that Mrs. Horace Ansley, 25 years ago, had been exquisitely lovely. No, you wouldn't believe would you? Believe it, would you? Though, of course, still charming, distinguished. Well, as a girl, that is to say, about Mrs. Ansley, as a girl, she had been exquisitely beautiful. The new standards, at any rate, she had been exquisite, a far more beautiful woman than her daughter Barbara, though certainly Babs, according to the new standards at any rate, was more effective, had more edge, as they say. Funny where she got it with those two nullities as parents. Yes, Horace Ansley was, well, just the duplicate of his wife. Museum specimens they were of old New York. good-looking, irreproachable, exemplary. Mrs. Slade and Mrs. Ansley had lived opposite each other, actually as well as figuratively, for years. When the drawing room curtains in number 20 East 73rd Street were renewed, number 23 across the way was always aware of it. And of all the movings, buyings, travels, anniversaries, illnesses, the tame chronicle of an estimable pair. Little of it escaped Mrs. Slade, but she had grown bored with it by the time her husband made his big coup in Wall Street. And when they bought in Upper Park Avenue, had already begun to think, I'd rather live opposite a speakeasy for a chance. At least one might see it raided. The idea of seeing Grace Ansley raided was so amusing that before the move, she, that is Mrs. Slade, launched it at a women's lunch. It made a hit and went around. She sometimes wondered if it had crossed the street and reached Mrs. Ansley. She hoped not, but didn't much mind. Those were the days when respectability was at a discount, and it did the irreproachable no harm to laugh at them a little. A few years later, not many months apart, both ladies lost their husbands. There was an appropriate exchange of wreaths and condolences, and a brief renewal of intimacy in the half-shadow of their mourning. And now, after another interval, they had run across each other in Rome at the same hotel, each of them the modest appendage of a salient daughter. The similarity of their lot had again drawn them together, lending itself to mild jokes, and the mutual confession that if in old days it must have been tiring to keep up with daughters, it was now at times a little dull not to. No doubt Mrs. Slade reflected she felt her unemployment more than poor Grace ever would. It was a big drop from being the wife of Delphine Slade to being his widow. She had always regarded herself, with a certain conjugal pride, as his equal in social gifts, as contributing her full share to the making of the exceptional couple that they were. But the difference after his death was irremediable. As the wife of the famous corporation lawyer, always with international case or two on hand, every day brought its exciting and unexpected obligation, the impromptu entertaining of eminent colleagues from abroad, the hurried dashes on legal business to London, Paris, or Rome, where the entertaining was so handsomely reciprocated. The amusement of hearing in her wake, "What, that handsome woman with the good clothes and the eyes is Mrs. Slade? The Slade's wife? Really? Generally, the wives of celebrities are such frumps." Yes, being the Slade's widow was a dullish business after that. In living up to such a husband, all her faculties had been engaged. Now she had only her daughter to live up to, for the son, who seemed to have inherited his father's gifts, had died suddenly in boyhood. She had fought through that agony because her husband was there, to be helped and to help. Now, after the father's death, the thought of the boy had become unbearable. There was nothing left but to mother her daughter. And dear Jenny was such a perfect daughter that she needed no excessive mothering. Now with Babs Ansley, that is Mrs. Ansley's daughter, with Babs Ansley, I don't know that I should be so quiet, Mrs. Slade sometimes thought, half enviously. But Jenny, who was younger than her brilliant friend, was that rare accident, an extremely pretty girl who somehow made youth and prettiness seem as safe as their absence. It was all perplexing, and to Mrs. Slade, a little boring. She wished that Jenny would fall in love with the wrong man even, that she might have to be watched, outmaneuvered, rescued. And instead it was Jenny who watched her mother, kept her out of drafts, made sure she had taken her tonic. Mrs. Ansley was much less articulate than her friend, and her mental portrait of Mrs. Slade was slighter and drawn with fainter touches. Alida Slade's awfully brilliant, Mrs. Ansley is thinking, but not as brilliant as she thinks, would have summed it up, though she would have added, for the enlightenment of strangers, that Mrs. Slade had been an extremely dashing girl, much more so than her daughter, who was pretty, of course, and clever in a way, but had none of her mother's swell vividness, as someone once had called it. No, Jenny was not like her mother. Sometimes Mrs. Ansley thought Alida Slade was disappointed. On the whole, she, Mrs. Slade, had had a sad life, full of failures and mistakes. Mrs. Ansley had always been rather sorry for her. So these two ladies visualized each other, each through the wrong end of her little telescope. Out and above the forum, suddenly the air was full of that deep clangor of bells which periodically covers Rome with a roof of silver. Mrs. Slade glanced at her wristwatch. 5 o'clock already, she said, as though surprised. Mrs. Ansley suggested interrogatively, "There's bridge at the embassy at 5. For a long time, Mrs. Slade did not answer. She appeared to be lost in contemplation, and Mrs. Ansley thought the remark had escaped her. But after a while, Mrs. Slade said, as if speaking out of a dream, "Bridge, did you say?" "Not unless you want to, but I don't think I will, you know." "Oh, no," Mrs. Ansley hastened to assure her. "I don't care to at all. It's all so lovely here and so full of memories, as you say." She settled herself in her chair and almost furtively drew forth her knitting. Mrs. Slade took sideways note of this activity, but her own beautifully cared for hands remained motionless on her knee. "I was just thinking," she said slowly, "what different things Rome stands for to each generation of travelers. To our grandmothers, Roman fever. To our mothers, sentimental dangers, how we used to be guarded. To our daughters, no more dangers than the middle of Main Street. They don't know it, but how much they're missing." The long golden light was beginning to pale, and Mrs. Ansley lifted her knitting a little closer to her eyes. "Yes, how we were guarded. I always used to think," Mrs. Slade continued, "that our mothers had a much more difficult job than our grandmothers. When Roman fever stalked the streets, it must have been comparatively easy to gather in the girls at the danger hour. But when you and I were young, with such beauty calling to us, and the spice of disobedience thrown in, and no worse risk of catching cold during the cold hour after sunset, the mothers used to be put to it to keep us in, didn't they?" She turned again towards Mrs. Ansley, but the latter had reached a delicate point in her knitting. 1, 2, 3, slip 2. Yes, they must have been," she assented, without looking up. Mrs. Slade's eyes rested on her with a deepened attention. "She can knit in the face of this. How like her," she thought. Mrs. Slade leaned back, brooding, her eyes ranging from the ruins which faced her to the long green hollow of the forum, the fading glow of the church fronts beyond it, and the outlying immensity of the Colosseum. Suddenly she thought, it's all very well to say that our girls have done away with sentiment and moonlight. But if Babs Ansley isn't out to catch that young aviator, the one who's a Marchesa, then I don't know anything. And my Jenny has no chance beside her. I know that too. I wonder if that's why Grace Ansley likes the two girls to go everywhere together. My poor Jenny as a foil." Mrs. Slade gave a hardly audible laugh. And at the sound, Mrs. Ansley dropped her knitting. Yes? Nothing. I was only thinking, Mrs. Slade here, how your Babs carries everything before her. That Campolieri boy is one of the best matches in Rome. Don't look so innocent, my dear. You know he is. And I was wondering ever so respectfully, you understand, wondering how two such exemplary characters as you and Horace had managed to produce anything quite so dynamic. Mrs. Slade laughed again with a touch of asperity. Mrs. Ansley's hands lay inert across her needles. She looked straight out at the great accumulated wreckage of passion and splendor at her feet, but her small profile was almost expressionless. At length she said, I think you overrate Babs, my dear. Mrs. Slade's tone grew easier. No, I don't. I appreciate her and perhaps envy you. Oh, my girl's perfect. If I were a chronic invalid, well, I think I'd rather be in Jenny's hands. But there must be time. I always wanted a brilliant daughter and never quite understood why I got an angel instead. Mrs. Ansley echoed her laugh in a faint murmur. Babs is an angel, too. Of course, but she's got rainbow wings, said Mrs. Slade. Well, they're wandering by the sea now with their young men, and here we sit, and it all brings back the past a little too acutely. Mrs. Ansley had resumed her knitting. One might almost have imagined, if one had known her less well, Mrs. Slade reflected, that for her also too many memories rose up from the lengthening shadows of those august ruins. But no, she seemed simply absorbed in her work. What was there to worry about? She, Mrs. Slade, and Mrs. Ansley knew that Babs would almost certainly come back engaged to the extremely eligible Campolieri. And she'll sell the New York house and settle down near them in Rome and never be in their way. She's much too tactful. But she'll be and have an excellent cook and just the right people in for bridge and cocktails and a perfectly peaceful old age among her grandchildren. Mrs. Slade broke off this prophetic flight with a recoil of self-disgust. There was no one of whom she had less right to think unkindly than Grace Ansley. Would she never cure herself of envying her? Perhaps she had begun too long ago. Mrs. Slade stood up and leaned against the parapet, filling her troubled eyes with the tranquilizing magic of the hour. But instead of tranquilizing her, the sight seemed to increase her exasperation. Her gaze turned toward the Colosseum. Already its golden flank was draped and drowned in purple shadow, and above it the sky curved crystal clear without light or color. It was the moment when the afternoon and evening hang balanced in mid-heaven. Mrs. Slade turned back and laid her hand on her friend's arm. The gesture was so abrupt that Mrs. Ansley looked up startled. The sun set. You're not afraid, my dear? Asked Mrs. Slade. Afraid? Of Roman fever or pneumonia. I remember how ill you were that winter. As a girl, you had a very delicate throat, hadn't you? Oh, we're all right up here. Down below in the Forum, it does get deathly cold all of a sudden, but not up here, Mrs. Slade. Ah, of course you know, because you had to be so careful. Mrs. Slade turned back to the parapet. She thought, I must make one more effort not to hate her. Aloud, she said, whenever I look at the Forum from up here, I remember that story about a great aunt of yours, wasn't she? A dreadfully wicked great aunt? Mrs. Ansley. Oh, yes, great Aunt Harriet, the one who was supposed to have sent her younger sister out to the Forum after sunset to gather a night-blooming flower for her album. All our great aunts and grandmothers used to have albums of dried flowers. Mrs. Slade nodded, but she really sent her because they were in love with the same man. Well, that was the family tradition. They said Aunt Harriet confessed it years afterward, and at any rate, the poor little sister caught the fever and died. Mother used to frighten us with the stories when we were children. And you frightened me with it that winter when you and I were here as girls, the winter I was engaged to Delson. Mrs. Ansley gave a faint laugh. Oh, did I really frighten you? I don't believe you're easily frightened. Not often, but I was then. I was easily frightened because I was too happy. I wonder if you know what that means. Yes, Mrs. Ansley faltered. Well, I suppose that was why the story of her wicked aunt made such an impression on me, and I thought, there's no more Roman fever, but the Forum is deathly cold after sunset, especially after a hot day, and the Colosseum's even colder and damper. The Colosseum? Yes, said Mrs. Slade. It wasn't easy to get in after the gates were locked for the night. Far from easy. Still, in those days, it could be managed. It was managed, often. Lovers met there who couldn't meet elsewhere. You knew that? I dare say I don't remember. You don't remember? You don't remember going to visit some ruins or other one evening just after dark and catching a bad chill? You were supposed to have gone to see the moonrise. People always said that expedition was what caused your illness. There was a moment's silence. Then Mrs. Ansley rejoined. Did they? It was all so long ago. Yes, and you got well again, so it didn't matter, but I suppose it struck your friends. The reason given for your illness. I mean, because everybody knew you were so prudent on account of your throat, and your mother took such care of you. You had been out late sightseeing, hadn't you, that night? Perhaps I had. The most prudent girls aren't always prudent. What made you think of it now? Mrs. Slade seemed to have no answer ready, but after a moment she broke out, because I simply can't bear it any longer. Mrs. Ansley lifted her head quickly. Her eyes were wide and very pale. Can't bear what? Why, you're not knowing that I've always known why you went. Mrs. Ansley. Why I went? Yes. You think I'm bluffing, don't you? Well, you went to meet the man I was engaged to. And I can repeat every word of the letter that took you there. Well, Mrs. Slade spoke. Mrs. Ansley had risen unsteadily to her feet. Her bag, her knitting, her gloves slid in a panic-stricken heap to the ground. She looked at Mrs. Slade as though she were looking at a ghost. No, don't, she faltered out. Why not? Listen, if you don't believe me, and then Mrs. Slade recites, my one darling, things can't go on like this. I must see you alone. Come to the Colosseum immediately after dark tomorrow. There will be somebody to let you in. No one whom you need fear will suspect. But perhaps you've forgotten what the letter said? Mrs. Ansley met the challenge with an unexpected composure. Steadying herself, she looked at her friend and replied, no, I know it by heart too. And the signature? Only your D.S., as in Delson Slade. Was that it? I'm right, am I? That was the letter that took you out that evening after dark. Mrs. Ansley was still looking at her. It seemed to Mrs. Slade that a slow struggle was going on behind the voluntarily controlled mask of her small, quiet face. I shouldn't have thought she had herself so well in hand, Mrs. Slate reflected, almost resentfully. But at this moment, Mrs. Ansley spoke. I don't know how you knew. I burned that letter at once. Mrs. Slade. Yes, you would, naturally. You're so prudent. The smear was open now. And if you burned the letter, you're wondering how on earth I know what was in it. That's it, isn't it? Mrs. Slade waited, but Mrs. Ansley did not speak. Well, my dear, I know what was in that letter because I wrote it. You wrote it? Yes. The two women stood for a minute, staring at each other in the last golden light. Then Mrs. Ansley dropped back into her chair. Oh, she murmured and covered her face with her hands. Mrs. Slade waited nervously for another word or movement. None came, and at length she broke out. I horrify you. Mrs. Ansley's hands dropped to her knees. The face they uncovered was streaked with tears. I wasn't thinking of you. I was thinking it was the only letter I ever had from him. And I wrote it. Yes, I wrote it. But I was the girl he was engaged to. Did you happen to remember that? Mrs. Ansley's head drooped again. I'm not trying to excuse myself. I remembered. And still you went. Still I went. Mrs. Slade stood looking down on the small bowed figure at her side. The flame of her wrath had already sunk, and she wondered why she had ever thought there would be any satisfaction in inflicting so purposeless a wound on her friend. But she had to justify herself. You do understand? I found out, and I hated you. I knew you were in love with Delphin, and I was afraid of you, of your quiet ways, your sweetness, well, I wanted you out of the way, that's all, just for a few weeks, just till I was sure of him. So in a blind fury, I wrote that letter. I don't know why. I'm telling you now. I suppose, Mrs. Ansley said slowly, it's because you've always gone on hating me. Perhaps, or perhaps I wanted to get the whole thing off my mind. She paused. I'm glad you destroyed the letter. Of course, I never thought you'd die. Mrs. Ansley relapsed into silence, and Mrs. Slade, leaning above her, was conscious of a strange sense of isolation, of being cut off from the warm current of human communion. You think me a monster. Mrs. Ansley, I don't know. It was the only letter I had, and you say you didn't write it. Ah, how you care for him still. I cared for that memory, said Mrs. Ansley. Mrs. Slade continued to look down on her. She seemed physically reduced by the blow, as if when she got up, the wind might scatter her like a puff of dust. Mrs. Slade's jealousy suddenly leapt up again at the sight. All these years, the woman had been living on that letter. How she must have loved him to treasure the mere memory of its ashes. The letter of the man her friend was engaged to. Wasn't it she who was the monster? Mrs. Slade, you tried your best to get him away from me, didn't you? But you failed, and I kept him. That's all. Yes, that's all. I wish now I hadn't told you. I had no idea you'd feel about it as you do. I thought you'd be amused. It all happened so long ago, as you say, and you must do me the justice to remember that I had no reason to think that you'd ever taken it seriously. How could I, when you were married to Horace Ansley 2 months afterwards? As soon as you could get out of bed, your mother rushed you off to Florence and married you to him. People were rather surprised. They wondered at it being done so quickly, but I thought I knew. I had an idea that you did it. You married him so quickly out of pique, to be able to say you got ahead of Delphin and me. You got married first. I had an idea of that pique. Kids have such silly reasons for doing the most serious things. and your marrying so soon convinced me that you've never really cared. Yes, I suppose it would, Mrs. Ansley assented. The corner where Mrs. Slade and Mrs. Ansley sat was still shadowy and deserted. For a long time, neither of them spoke. At length, Mrs. Slade began again. I suppose I did it as a sort of joke. A joke? Well, girls are ferocious sometimes, you know, girls in love especially. And I remember laughing to myself all that evening at the idea that you were waiting around there in the dark, dodging out of sight, listening for every sound, trying to get in. Of course I was upset when I heard you were so ill afterward. Mrs. Ansley had not moved for a long time, but now she turned slowly toward her companion. But I didn't wait. He'd arranged everything. He was there. We were let in at once, she said. Mrs. Slade sprang up from her leaning position. Telfin Fair? They let you in? Ah, now you're lying, she burst out with violence. Mrs. Ansley's voice grew clearer and full of surprise. But of course he was there. Naturally he came. Came? How did he know he'd find you there? You must be raving. Mrs. Ansley hesitated, as though reflecting. But I answered the letter. I told him I'd be there, so he came. Mrs. Slade flung her hands up to her face. Oh, God, you answered. I never thought of your answering. It's odd you never thought of it if you wrote the letter. Yes, I was blind with rage. Mrs. Ansley rose and threw her fur scarf around her. It is cold here. We'd better go. I'm sorry for you, she said, as she clasped the fur about her throat. The unexpected words sent a pang through Mrs. Slade. Yes, we'd better go. She gathered up her bag and cloak. I don't know why you should feel sorry for me, she muttered. Mrs. Ansley stood looking away from her toward the dusky mask of the Colosseum. Well, because I didn't have to wait that night. Mrs. Slade gave an unquiet laugh. Yes, I was beaten there, but I oughtn't to begrudge it to you, I suppose. At the end of all these years, after all, I had everything. I had him for 25 years, and you had nothing but that one letter that he didn't write. Mrs. Ansley was silent. At length, she took a step toward the door of the terrace and turned back, facing her companion. I had Barbara, she said, and began to move ahead of Mrs. Slade towards the stairway. That's the end. She had Barbara. So shall we have some discussion? I feel like you need to be silent after that conclusion and all.
I love it. Oh, that's great.
It's a brilliant story.
Oh,
and
God.
I did want to say one thing. If you were as knocked out by this story, any and all of you, as I was when I first read it, and continue to be really, if you go back and look at the story again now, having reached the end, and you look at the way the story is choreographed, when the women stand up, when they sit down, when they drop things, when they pick them up or not, there is it is like choreographed to be acted out, or maybe even expressed and interpreted as a ballet. Even the idea that the directions at the end, I'm already thinking about it as a dramatic presentation, but that over and over again, clearly Mrs. Slade is so powerful and so dominating, and her passions they're not greater than Mrs. Ansley's, but they're much closer to the surface, and she never hesitates to express them. But that the words in the final sentence are Mrs. Ansley saying quietly, "I had Barbara," and began to move ahead of Mrs. Slade towards the stairway. Those words, she began to move ahead, because on some level, the exchange of information is a competition from the very beginning. And at this moment, he began to move ahead.
Wow.
Thank you. Anyway, there's so much in it, even more than first time you read it for the story, the plot, what's happening.
Right.
After that, it just gets richer. So are there questions or comments from the chat group that whoever can see that is going to ask people to talk about?
Ollie, you're on.
We do have a question from Pat Nemirovsky. OMG, who's Barbara's real father? Exclamation point, exclamation point.
Is that a real question?
Yeah.
Is that a real question?
It was.
Well, who is the vivid of the two husbands? Who is the person who is active and vivid, and who is the husband who is part of a very quiet, according to Mrs. Slade, dull life?
Yeah.
The Barbara's father is Mr. Slade.
Of course.
That one night in the Coliseum.
Yep.
That.
So,
Has anybody ever found out if this short story has been made into a film of any sort? Because many of Edith Wharton's
Yes.
stories have been.
I am not aware. Maybe somebody else is. I'm not aware of this one.
She does such a wonderful job of choreography, of characters. Slight movements are retelling. And she just is a master at nuance. You have to read it with an alert mind, because otherwise it just sort of goes through in a blur and doesn't seem to say much or do much, in my opinion. I've read several of her books, loved every one. She's just a wonderful writer.
so
Maybe the problem also, maybe the problem with filming it is that if you think about it, about this story and filming things, is that nothing happens. Two ladies sit together and they look out over Rome, and then they leave. That's all. So most of the story is internal and also of the past. The speech is far less than what's happening underneath. How do you film that? That's why I thought about ballet, where you could express it without words. But I don't know. I'm backing away so more discussion of this can take place if people want to discuss it.
Right. So,
Well,
Joanne, this is Mark. I have a question for you. And
Sure.
I don't know how I missed this. How did Delphine find out to join Ansley at the Coliseum for their assignation?
Oh, she writes him a letter. She sends him a note.
Oh.
When Mrs. Ansley, when Grace Ansley, when she isn't Ansley yet, but when she gets the letter that Mrs. Slade, Alita, sends, she just sends a note back to him and says, sure.
Confirming
that
when
simple.
he's going to arrive. Yeah. So she gets confirmation that he's going to join her at the Coliseum, unbeknownst to Mrs. Wade. and so she triggers the whole series of events.
Right. And it's not expected. There's a wonderful dramatic irony to it that we even figured out. We may not figure out the part about Barbara, although when you go back a second time, there's so many hints of how much more she is like Mrs. Slade's husband. But that doesn't mean, it doesn't have to mean anything, you know? But the irony when you think about Mrs. Slade, who was so envious of the daughter that Mrs. Ansley has and can't understand how the daughter of Mrs. Ansley and her husband could be so capable, so vivid, so the word they used to use, brilliant, which has nothing to do with IQ. And she's so envious because that's the daughter that she, Mrs. Slade, would have expected to have, not Jenny, who is more like the way she sees the Ansleys.
We have another question from Michelle. Why do you think she waited so long to bring up this topic?
Well, if somebody else would like to answer it, I mean, I've got an answer, but if somebody else wants to answer first, it's hard to conduct discussion without seeing hands popping up. If there aren't any, well, here's my answer, but it's just mine, okay? I think partly it's something that's best kept unthought through. I mean, I think that it's perfectly possible that Mrs. Slade at some level continues to feel resentment and jealousy and envy and all these things is because there's at some level she must know something about this. And when they are together, there's a reason, even if they were so intimate as friends early on, there's a reason why they stopped being that. Part of it is that Mr. Slade had this great coup on Wall Street, and they were rich, and they moved to a much more impressive neighborhood and so forth. But still, they could have continued the friendship, except there was this underlying complication that was generally unpleasant. I mean, finally, Mrs. Slade knows that whatever else there was, that Mrs. Ansley was in love with the man she had been engaged to. And even though that engagement worked out, I think being back in Rome this way, sitting at and looking at the sites that they had seen when they were young, I just think that it all brought it back.
I think there's another level that goes back to the very beginning of the story when they talk about how Mrs. Slade was a support and adjunct to her husband and shared in his brilliance by reflection as opposed to she herself being brilliant. And so her life was focused on his, and that was the role of women in the Gilded Age. But when he died, she lost the centering of her life. She had time to become much more resentful of the loss of the reflected brilliance of her husband. She was no longer that brilliant woman associated with the brilliant man. So she had time to let the jealousy and the old resentments come to the surface because there was nothing to prevent her from doing that. And Ainsley, Mrs. Ainsley, Grace, was a constant reminder that she had this brilliant, beautiful daughter, very, very beautiful daughter, apparently. And she outshone Mrs. Slade's daughter in every respect. And so it just brought that jealousy back into the forefront. And I would add a couple paragraphs. So, you know, at the very beginning, they're talking about the relationships between mothers and daughters and the descriptions of the daughters. That's at the very beginning of the story. And that's really the prompt that brings out all this repressed anger and jealousy that she's had all her life.
I think that's right on. I think it's a very good point. So when you add together the lack of any sense of urgency or importance, that she has lost when she loses her husband, and of course she has already lost her son, so that she no longer has such big shoes to fill, more or less. But also, as she says in the beginning, as you have observed, also she doesn't have a daughter who needs looking after.
Right.
Whereas Barbara or Bab, I mean, while she's not a bad girl or anything, but she's active and adventurous and has so many suitors and so forth, so that she gives Mrs. Ansley something to look after and to keep abreast of, and in a way keeps her feelings and her mind busy outside of her own world. And Mrs. Slade doesn't have either of those things anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good.
So I'd like to ask some of the men in the discussion group if they could contribute their perspective, because these stories that she writes, that the author writes, are so women-focused, and the little subtle jealousies and nuances of their constricted lives. How does that, prompt a reaction on your part? Because I think a man's reading of this would be very different from a woman's reading. At least I anticipate that would be so. Joe.
Joseph, I think you have to unmute yourself, Joseph. For some reason, Zoom wouldn't do it.
It was hard for me to hear everything in the story. The sound didn't come across that well. It might be my computer. But one thing that struck me, and it's happened to me, is that you find yourself in a situation where things are dredged up, going back years and years, and you say something which is frankly unkind, and it's something which any of us can happen to any of us. That's what struck me most about this story. It wasn't so much the circumstance as the recall and the resentment and the feelings that it brings out and what you do with them.
Yeah, because if you think about it, there's really the story of Grace's falling ill after her going to the forum and getting very chilled and being sick afterwards. But that's just an incident, by virtue of them sitting there overlooking that area. It brings up all those old memories from back in their young womanhood. And so that could be what the trigger was for Alida to start digging into that old memory and that resentment, and bringing out the story of the letter that she wrote, not her husband or her fiance at the time. So yeah, there's all these lovely intertwining reasons that come together in stages. So really, it bears reading a second time at least. I loved it. I loved it. But Joe, I always love her.
Could I just ask one quick question? Joe and Mark, what do you think of the fiance who went and met this woman? I mean, what does this say about him? He's engaged to another woman. He gets this letter from her friend, and off he goes to meet her.
And then gets her pregnant.
Yes. Well, we're not 100% sure.
Oh, come on.
I'm with you that morning.
Well, if he was tempted, and he did what people do when they're tempted, they either give in or they ignore, or they do their best to get away from that situation. But he gave in.
Well, I mean, and he's not any more guilty than she is.
Sure.
Absolutely.
I mean, she went. She had a choice.
Exactly.
But to say that the pregnancy was a questionable, a question mark, one of the sentences near the end, she went rushing off to get married before her friend. And the reason she got married is pregnant, and she's got to get married quickly.
Absolutely. That's the story.
There's no doubt in my mind that she was pregnant by the fiance of her friend, and that she had to get married to one of her suitors, so that she wouldn't be left disgraced and blackballed by society.
You remember the language that Mrs. Slade uses, your mother, once you recovered from your illness, that she did contract, you know, in the Coliseum. And she had a delicate throat. Who knows? Maybe she had tonsil. She needed to have her tonsils out, and they don't. But whatever it was, so she was sick, and then the mother whisked her away. Also, she had gotten maybe past the morning sickness stage, and found her somebody to marry. And we shouldn't be surprised that the man that she marries, that her mother found for her, would be somebody who was quiet, who was not interested in, you know, he was introverted, it sounds like. It doesn't sound like she was unhappy in the least. So, I mean, he was a decent person. But everybody has 10 fingers, or at least most of us have 9, and there's no question that the husband needed to know before the wedding that she was pregnant. And in spite of that, he married her. And, yeah, there's no question about that. But they both, I was going to say they both knew what they were doing. Well, they didn't really, but they're young. I mean, people do this. The behaviors are all, they're all like they're all understandable, even if they aren't admirable. They're understandable things. And the burden of it really falls onto Mrs. Slade, who engineered the whole thing. And the burden really, truly wasn't, didn't like grab hold so much until her husband died. Because otherwise, except for the loss, I say except for it, I mean, she lost her son, and that was a terrible, agonizing time, but she still had a daughter, and she was envious. And I mean, that's a human quality. You know, you love, people can love their child beyond imagining, and yet still wish that the child was a little bit more like your friend's daughter or something like that. But it's the hatred that eats her up alive that is the terrible thing in this story, and precipitates what for her is a crisis. I mean, when this meeting and is over, the friendship, of course, is over. But it wasn't a steady in their worlds anyway. It wasn't a constant, their friendship, because it was just by bumping into each other in the same hotel in Rome that they happened to rekindle it in this time. But Mrs. Ansley still has this wonderful daughter, and she has to, of course, deal now with the fact that he didn't write the letter. On the other hand, he answered her and came. And so that was what both apparently wanted, at least for that night.
Well, you know, the one thing that struck me about this is, like, if you're going to talk about a guy listening, it was a very genteel conversation about a really nasty thing. And
it's sort of buttoned down, right?
Right. I could see them each having, you know, biscuits and tea and sitting on the porch and saying, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Joellen, but I think one of the themes is the search for truth. That she's, because it seems that they're looking for the truth about the ending and the child. And
it's a very harsh truth.
It's a very harsh truth. But, you know, Edith Wharton took like really tough things. I mean, it was infidelity. It just wasn't, they ended up at the Coliseum and had a little smooch.
Right.
And you know, and they wanted, and Slade wanted Ainsley to get sick. Could have killed her, you know. But there are these two lovely little high-class women sitting there talking in very soft terms about very terrible things. And that's what struck me, where I think men would have basically said, well, you know, like, why did you go there? And you know, I really
plugged it out.
Yeah.
But men were always in charge, and women were expected to be these compliant, beautiful adjuncts to
Right.
men's lives. And they didn't dare have opinions of their own. Then when they married, they lost their rights to their money, their came with the marriage. They lost all rights to their families. They got divorced. The husband took the children, and the wife was left disgraced. Edith Wharton,
it was because they were property. Wives and children were property.
Exactly. And if a woman was cast off and divorced, she went into poverty and often committed suicide because their only alternative was to go into some form of service. And if you were an upper class woman, that just wasn't feasible. You couldn't make the money to maintain your lifestyle.
Become a nun.
Yeah.
Tricky when you had children.
There were careers for women except marriage. It was marriage or nothing, or the workhouse. But yeah, it's intensely interesting because, the comment about how men would have been much more open about it, I don't think so. Not in the Victorian era. They were, the Victorians were notorious for their straight-laced morality code, but they were lascivious and loose and free with their morals in private.
Right.
They were, and that's what Edith Wharton talks about so often, is their morality was all a facade, that they were just as bad as we are in the 21st century, and maybe worse, but because men had, no constraints on what they did. They had mistresses on the side, sometimes several marriages. They got away with murder, and the women paid for that. They had no rights. Their property was no longer theirs when they were married. Their children weren't even theirs. They were, any taint of scandal, and they would have been, the doors of society would have been closed to them. So when Grace Ainsley has her little fling in the forum and gets pregnant, and I don't believe she actually was sick. I think she told her mom what happened. She got pregnant, and her mom was busily arranging a marriage, because if she was left with a pregnant daughter, the whole family would be scandalized and shut out of society.
Right.
So, I think it's Wharton just peeling back the layers of hypocrisy in a very quiet, ladylike way. The conversation of two women, it all comes out in a very polite way, but it's scathing. I just love it.
Yeah,
She is so talented.
So I'm still amazed at Edith Wharton about what a wonderful person she was. But I'll just read something that in 1921, she became the first woman to win a Pulitzer, above and beyond everything else that she did.
Wow.
But there is a somewhat of a back story here. Let's see. I can't. Did I miss it here? Let's see. Okay. So in the June 22nd edition of the New Republic, Robert Morse Lovett, a juror for the Nobel Prize, wrote that the age of innocence had not, in fact, been the jury's choice. The jury favored Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, but the Pulitzer Board overturned its decision. So even then, she was getting, the women's side was getting a little prejudiced back then. But
oh yeah, and that is clearly one of her best. But there's another one that's a story of a woman who becomes a fallen woman and is shut out of society. And I can't think of the name of it. I read it for a book discussion.
The House of Mirth. It's the House of Mirth.
That's it. Wonderful story. Yep. Absolutely riveting stuff. And it's a story about how a woman falls out of grace and out of all society. And it's just gut-wrenching. It really makes you understand what women had to go through to stay safe, and how this woman who falls out of favor loses all safety net. And it's really a great read. Great read. So,
and she's somebody. I'm backing off because I want whoever's talking to talk, not me. I already talked.
Yeah. I said all I gotta say.
Oh, I thought somebody else had begun to speak. I was just going to say then that Lily Bart, who is the main character, the heroine in The House of Mirth, that she is exemplary in terms of what happens to a woman who waits a little bit too long. She is looking for some kind of perfection that is just hard to locate. And on some level, she's also too independent a thinker.
That's right.
And she challenges. Men feel drawn to her. They fall in love with her, but she is a challenge in so many ways to them, and that's not what they want. They want some lily, right? They want just some beautiful flower. They don't want, somebody with opinions or ideas or who would like to have different levels of relationships with different people, including men. And she doesn't have any money because her father loses everything on Wall Street. And then, so that she's not a whole package anymore. She finds herself in her early 20s, but which is already, it's high time for her to marry, and she no longer brings money or property. And in the end, there really is nothing left for her. She can't get enough even to eat. All these people who are supposed to be having a relationship with her, they are just, it's not good anymore.
Yeah,
So,
they're sunshine friends, and they abandon her in her need.
Yeah,
and that is all about how shallow the Victorians are. They have these rules and regulations, and since she flouted some of them, she wasn't loose and lascivious, but she was an independent thinker, which was not okay. And it's all about Edith Wharton dissecting the rules of society and shaping it around this woman who has so much to offer, so beautiful, has so many admirers, but yet ends up in the poorhouse and suicidal. It's an amazing story, and doesn't have all the glitz and glamour of Age of Innocence, but it is really very interesting.
Yeah.
I just want to let Joellen know that we had two other comments. One from Pat Nemirovsky, again, just saying brilliant story. And then from Carol Raviola that The House of Mirth was made into a movie that starred Gillian Anderson.
Mm-hmm. As was The Age of Innocence.
Yes.
Which is Michelle Pfeiffer.
Right.
And I think it won several Academy Awards, and part of it was filmed right here in Philadelphia.
Wow.
Yeah, at the Opera House, at our Opera House on Main Street, on South Broad Street. They filmed a couple of scenes, and they invited people, and I was trying to get in the audience. You had to wear a Victorian costume in order to get a seat in the orchestra pit so that you could be part of the film, and I couldn't find a costume in time. But it was filmed here. A lot of scenes are filmed here. That's a great film, and won several Oscars. I'm not sure. I don't think it won Best Picture, but close to it.
What was the title of that?
Pardon?
That was The Age of Innocence.
And that's available. It's a classic, and it's brilliant, beautifully done, and it's very faithful to the book. Which is not always the case.
No, very few are. That's right. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you all.
Although I have to. Oh, I just a sentence. My daughter's book club is talking about Age of Innocence this week, and so she and I last night, I think, we watched the film. It's very, very, very beautiful in the way that, with the detail and like paintings, all of it. That Martin Scorsese did it, and but it's very slow. I found very slow. So that's just me last night.
But it's so truthful. It's so faithful to the book
Oh, absolutely.
Nothing happens
Absolutely.
rapidly. It's not like an action
Yeah.
film here, and that you can
Plus the-
complete in 2 hours. You
Yeah.
have to be patient with her nuances, because
Sure.
by the end of the film, you're really invested in all the characters, and you are caught up emotionally with them, which doesn't happen in 90% of the films that we produce in Hollywood today. That's why it's such a brilliant film. It is slow, patient, and everything. The costuming was meticulous.
Yes.
And the
Yes,
shots
beautiful.
on location,
Very beautiful.
amazing. Really great film. This has been fun.
Somebody was trying to end the class. Was it you, Mark?
Well, I was just saying we're getting close to the 5 o'clock hour, but if people
Yeah,
still have
okay.
things to do, we can continue. I mean, we
I
don't
just wanted to
need.
say I loved this. This is my first experience with your group, and I can't wait to hear the Borneo one, which I'm signed up for. But keep up the good work. I'm not in your Penn's Village. I'm in NVN, Northwest Village Network.
Oh, cool.
And I live in Germantown. So I'm thrilled that this is available, because we don't do this on our site. We don't have as many members as you do. And but this has been great fun, and I can't wait to do it again.
Well,
Thanks
thank
very
you.
much.
And we look forward to seeing you and everybody else again. And Joellen Winters, what a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you, everybody,
everybody.
for reading and
Thank
talking.
you. It's been great fun. I loved it.